Most people see 40 Hell's Angels pulling into a church parking lot in the middle of a rainstorm, and they move to the other side of the street. They see danger. They see trouble. They see 40 very good reasons to be somewhere else. They see leather and chrome and patches and 40 men who have not had an easy life and are not trying to look like they have. But on a wet Saturday morning in November in Grover's Mill, West Virginia, a 78-year-old woman named Ruth Calloway saw something else entirely. She saw 40 men caught in the rain without an umbrella between them. So she crossed the parking lot of First Baptist Church on legs that hadn't been steady in 3 years. And she held out the one she had, and she said 4 words that nobody in that parking lot expected to hear. She said, "You boys look cold." What happened that winter, what those 40 men decided, quietly and without announcement, to do for a woman who had given them the only thing she had that day, is the kind of story that gets harder to tell the more you think about it. Not because it is complicated, because it is not. Because it is simply what people are supposed to do for one another, and the fact that it still surprises us when it happens is the whole problem with the world, and the whole reason this story matters. Grover's Mill sits in a fold of the Appalachian Ridgeline, in the part of West Virginia that the bypass took the traffic out of sometime in the 1990s and never gave it back. The main street has a hardware store, a diner called May's, a post office open 4 days a week, and a Dollar General that went in 6 years ago and promptly closed half of what was left. The church on Birch Hollow Road, First Baptist, white clapboard, the kind of steeple that appears in every painting of the American countryside without anyone having to plan it, has been there since 1891. The parking lot was added in 1963, and the asphalt has been making its own decisions ever since. On the second Saturday of November, it was raining the way West Virginia rains in November. Not dramatically, not in sheets or gusts, just steadily and completely, the way rain falls when it has decided this is its job and it intends to do it properly. The temperature was 38 degrees. Everything was gray. The mountains were gray. The road was gray. The sky had the look of a ceiling that had forgotten it was ever anything else. 40 motorcycles had come off the interstate an hour earlier and pulled into the church lot because the ride captain, a man named Trace Bowen, had a brother buried in the cemetery behind that church. Every year on the second Saturday of November, Trace made the ride from Charleston. Most years, he rode alone. This year, without anyone asking him to or planning it, 39 men had simply shown up at the rally point that morning and said they were coming too. It was not discussed. It was not organized. It was the kind of thing that happens when enough years have passed and enough people understand what a thing costs a man to do alone. They parked and they walked to the grave, and they stood there in the rain without umbrellas or complaints, and they were quiet for as long as Trace needed them to be quiet. Then they walked back to the lot. That was when Ruth Calloway came across the parking lot toward them. Trace Bowen saw her coming, and his first instinct was what anyone's first instinct would be: to move, to get out of the way, to give a small elderly woman the wide berth she probably wanted from 40 wet bikers standing in her church parking lot. He was 6'2", 230 pounds, and wearing a cut that had seen more roads than most people see in a lifetime. He stepped aside. She didn't want the wide berth. She walked directly to him, umbrella extended in both hands, and she looked up at him with clear gray eyes and said, "You boys look cold." Trace Bowen looked at the umbrella. He looked at the woman holding it. He looked at the rain. "Ma'am," he said, "we can't take your umbrella." "You can," she said, "and you will." "I've got a hat." She was wearing a hat, a pale blue wool hat, slightly damp, pulled down over white hair. She was wearing a coat that had seen many winters. a pair of rubber-soled shoes with Velcro closures, and an expression that had the particular authority of a woman who had spent 78 years being right about things and was not going to start being wrong now. Trace Bowen took the umbrella. He would spend a long time afterward thinking about that moment, about the weight of it. Not the umbrella, which was light and slightly bent on one rib, but the gesture itself. A woman who had nothing extra, giving the only thing she had that morning to 40 strangers. Not because she expected anything from them. Not because she wanted anything. But because they were cold, and she was the kind of person who noticed when someone was cold. He did not know yet that she had walked a quarter mile to get to that church that morning. That she had no car. That she had no one to drive her. That she came every second Saturday of November regardless of the weather, because her husband Earl had been a deacon at First Baptist for 31 years, and showing up was what Earl would have done. And Ruth Calloway was not going to stop doing what Earl would have done just because Earl was no longer there to do it. He didn't know any of that yet. He just held the umbrella and said, "Can we at least give you a ride home?" And Ruth Calloway looked at him for a moment with those clear gray eyes and said, "I suppose that would be all right." Before we get to what Trace Bowen found when he walked Ruth Calloway to her front door, if you're new here, hit subscribe and drop your city and state in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. I read every single one. Now, back to Grover's Mill, West Virginia, and a front door that was about to change what 40 men did with their winter. Ruth Lucille Calloway, Namarsh, was born in 1946 in the house on Canary Creek Road, where she still lived, which had been her parents' house and her grandparents' house before that. She had married Earl Calloway in 1968 in the white clapboard church she still walked to every second Saturday, and they had lived in that house for 54 years together and raised 2 children in it. A son named Daniel, who worked in Pittsburgh and called on Sundays, and a daughter named Lena, who had moved to Phoenix 12 years ago and sent cards at Christmas and birthdays that always arrived 3 days late, which Ruth had never once mentioned. She and Earl had sat on the porch of that house on summer evenings watching the ridge go dark. They had kept a garden in the back, tomatoes and green beans, and a row of sunflowers Earl planted every spring because Ruth liked them. They had not been wealthy. They had not traveled. They had been, in all the ways that are harder to measure than money, very rich. Earl Calloway had died 19 months ago. A Tuesday morning in April, his heart, which had been unreliable for a decade and had been talked to sternly by 3 different cardiologists, had finally made up its mind. Ruth had been in the kitchen making oatmeal. She had not heard him fall. She had found him. She did not talk about this. There was no one to talk to about it. Particularly, Daniel called on Sundays, and the calls lasted 11 minutes and covered the weather and his work and the grandchildren's school schedules. And Ruth listened and asked the right questions and said she was fine when he asked, which he did, always, at the 9-minute mark. She was fine in all the ways that could be reported in a Sunday phone call. She was not fine in the ways that could not. The house on Canary Creek Road was in the condition that houses reach when one person is managing what 2 people used to manage together. The porch steps had gone soft on the left side, where water had been getting under the wood for 2 winters. The gutters on the north face were pulling away from the fascia. There was a window in the back bedroom that didn't seal anymore, and when the wind came off the ridge at night, it came through the gap, and Ruth had folded a dish towel into the frame to stop the sound of it, which worked somewhat. The furnace was a 1987 Carrier that Earl had serviced himself every October, and since Earl was gone, it had not been serviced, and it ran the way things run when they are tired, and nobody is paying proper attention. She had $1,140 in her checking account. Social Security came on the third Wednesday. The oil for the furnace cost $287 the last time she'd had it filled, which had been in October. And she had watched the gauge, and she knew what she had left, and she had done the math, and the math was not something she allowed herself to do more than once a day, because doing it more than once did not change the answer, and only made the space between the walls feel smaller. She had a neighbor named Bev Haskins, who brought a casserole on Tuesdays. She had Daniel's Sunday calls. She had the walk to First Baptist on the second Saturday of November. She had been managing. This was the front door that Trace Bowen knocked on that afternoon, after riding Ruth home on his Harley, with her holding the umbrella over both of them, which she did with the calm matter-of-factness of a woman who had adapted to stranger situations than this, without much fuss. He had helped her to the door. He had waited while she found her key. And when the door swung open and he caught a glimpse of the inside, the dish towel in the window frame, the thermostat dial he could see from the entryway, set to 61 degrees. The kitchen table with one chair pushed in and one left out at an angle, the vase of dried sunflowers on the sill that had been there long enough to lose most of their color. He had gone very still. Ruth turned back to thank him. He was looking at the sunflowers. "Those were Earl's," she said, not sadly, just as information. Trace Bowen looked at the front porch steps, the soft left side, the way the wood had gone gray and spongy. He looked at the gutter pulling free above the door. He looked at this woman in her blue wool hat and her Velcro shoes, who had walked a quarter-mile in 38-degree rain and given away her umbrella because 40 strangers looked cold. And something happened in his chest that he was not going to describe to anyone, but that he would feel for a long time. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything," she said. "I'm 78. Time's shorter than it used to be. Are you doing all right? I mean," he paused, "the house, the winter coming. Are you managing okay?" Ruth looked at him with those clear gray eyes for a moment. "I'm managing," she said. Trace Bowen had been riding roads for 22 years. He had heard a lot of ways people answered that question. He knew what managing meant. He knew the particular kind of pride and the particular kind of ache that lived in the word when a person said it standing in front of a house with a dish towel in the window and a thermostat set to 61 degrees and one chair left out at an angle because someone used to sit in it. He took out his phone. He called Phil Reese on the way back to the interstate. Phil was the club's chapter president, 49 years old. A man who had been fixing things with his hands since he was 17, who had a flatbed truck and a contractor's license, and a set of opinions about porch joists that he was willing to share at length. Trace described the porch, the gutters, the window, the furnace. He described the sunflowers in the vase on the sill. He described Ruth Calloway walking across a rainy church parking lot on legs that weren't steady, holding out the one umbrella she had, saying, "You boys look cold." Phil Reese was quiet for a moment. "I'll call Tommy," he said. Tommy ran the Lewisburg chapter. "You call Rand." Trace called Rand. Rand called the Beckley group. By the time Trace merged back onto the interstate, his phone had buzzed 11 times with variations of the same word, "in." There was no meeting about it. There was no vote. There was no one who asked whether it was worth the trouble, or whether a woman they'd met that morning deserved the effort. There was no discussion of what they would get in return for driving 2 hours into the hills on a series of cold Saturdays to fix a dead man's porch. The question did not arise, because the question did not apply. Ruth Calloway had given them the only umbrella she had. The only possible answer was the one they gave. Phil Reese showed up at Canary Creek Road the following Saturday morning at 8:15 with a flatbed carrying 240 board feet of pressure-treated pine and a cooler with enough sandwiches for a work crew. Because he had learned, over 22 years of doing this kind of thing, that you bring the food or the food does not exist. He had not called ahead. He had knocked. Ruth had opened the door in a housecoat and looked at the flatbed in her driveway, and at Phil Reese, who she had not met, and at the three men standing behind him, and she had said, "What is all this?" "Porch steps," Phil said. "Trace Bowen sent us." Ruth looked at the flatbed. She looked at Phil. She looked at the three men. "I haven't got money for, we know," Phil said. "That's why we brought our own lumber." Ruth opened her mouth and then closed it, and then looked at the soft left side of her porch steps for a long moment. "Earl would have fixed those in April," she said. "We're a little late," Phil said, "but we'll get them done." Ruth looked at him for another moment. "I'll make coffee," she said. Over the course of that first Saturday, Phil and his three men replaced the porch steps, reattached the north gutter with new hardware, and sealed the fascia properly, and pulled the dish towel out of the back bedroom window, and reglazed the frame with caulk that would hold through March. While they worked, Ruth brought coffee at intervals and occasionally stood at the corner of the porch watching, not speaking, with an expression that was not quite any single identifiable thing, but that had in it something that looked like a person remembering how it felt when the world behaved the way it was supposed to. At noon, Phil went inside to check the furnace. He was in the basement for 22 minutes. When he came up, he was quieter than he had been going down, and he told Ruth that the heat exchanger had a crack, and that running the furnace as it was would be running it at about 60% efficiency, and spending money on oil to heat the air between the walls rather than the rooms. He told her this plainly, without drama, because she was the kind of woman who deserved plain information. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "How much is a new one?" she said. Phil told her. She was quiet again. "I see," she said. "Don't worry about that yet," Phil said. She looked at him with those clear gray eyes. "Young man," she said, "I have been worrying about that since September. Telling me not to worry about it does not change what it costs." Phil looked at the floor. "No, ma'am," he said. "That's fair." He went back outside and called Trace. The call went 3 directions at once. Trace called the Charleston chapter. Phil called Tommy in Lewisburg. Tommy called Rand in Beckley. And somewhere in the phone tree that night, a man named Vic Shear, who ran a heating and cooling supply outfit out of Morgantown and had been a Hells Angels associate for 11 years, picked up his phone and heard the short version of the story and said, "What model is the furnace?" And when Phil told him, Vic was quiet for a moment and then said, "I've got one. Carrier, 2021, came back from a new build cancellation. It's been sitting in my warehouse since March. What do you need for it?" Phil said. "I need," Vic said, "for you to tell me when you're ready to install it." The furnace went in the following Friday. Vic drove it down himself in his supply truck, and Phil and a man named Chester, who was a certified vac technician from the Lewisburg chapter, installed it in 4 hours while Ruth sat at her kitchen table and drank tea and tried 3 times to give Phil Reese money, which he declined 3 times with the patient consistency of a man who has made up his mind and knows that making up his mind is. The end of the conversation. When they were done, the house on Canary Creek Road was warm in a way it had not been warm since October of the previous year. Ruth stood in the kitchen with her hands around her tea, and she was quiet for a long time. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Finally. "Do what?" Phil said. "Except this much," she said. "I don't know how to do that." Phil leaned against the counter. My grandmother, he said, used to say that taking care of people is easy. Letting people take care of you is the hard part. That's where the real courage is. Ruth Calloway looked at him. Her eyes went wet, briefly. And then she did what she did with things like that. She absorbed it, composed herself, set it somewhere she would come back to later. Your grandmother, she said, sounds like she was a smart woman. She was, Phil said. She would have liked you. That should have been the end of it. The porch was fixed. The gutter was sealed. The window held. The furnace ran. It should have been a story with a clean conclusion. Strangers repay a kindness. Everyone goes home feeling decent about the world. But November turned into December. And December in West Virginia means something specific about roads and isolation and the way warmth inside a house can become the only warmth available for days at a stretch. And somewhere in the first week of December, Trace Bowen started thinking about Ruth Calloway sitting at a kitchen table with one chair left out at an angle and a thermostat she was now. Afraid to set too low because the man who had always managed the furnace was not there to manage it anymore. He drove out on a Wednesday. No announcement, no occasion. He brought a cord of firewood in the bed of his truck because Phil had mentioned that Ruth had a wood stove in the living room that she hadn't used since Earl died because splitting wood was not something her legs allowed her anymore. And a cord of seasoned hardwood on a cold Wednesday in December is not a small thing to give a person who lives alone. He stacked it himself under the overhang at the side of the house where it would stay dry, and then he knocked on the door and Ruth opened it and looked at the wood and looked at him and said, Trace Bowen, you have too much time on your hands. He laughed. She made him soup. He came back the following Wednesday and the Wednesday after that, not always with something. Sometimes just to sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee and talk, which Ruth did with the warmth and precision of a woman who had spent 54 years being a good conversationalist with someone she loved and had not yet found another outlet for the habit. She told him about Earl, about the garden, about the sunflowers, which Earl had planted every April, not because he particularly loved sunflowers himself, but because Ruth did, and that was the kind of man he was, she said. The kind of man who planted what the other person loved. Trace listened. He was not a man who was gifted with words, but he was a man who was gifted with attention, which is rarer and, in the end, more useful. In the third week of December, without any plan or announcement, other men started showing up. Chester came one Saturday and cleaned the chimney flue so the wood stove ran properly. Tommy from Lewisburg brought a younger man named Aurelio, who rehung the back screen door that had been rubbing the frame since summer. Rand drove up from Beckley on a Sunday afternoon with a bag of groceries because he had called ahead and asked Ruth if she needed anything, and she had said no, she was fine. And then he had called Bev Haskins, whose number Trace had gotten, and Bev had told him what Ruth actually needed, and so he brought it. Ruth opened the door and saw the groceries and said, I told you I was fine. You did, Rand said. Bev said different. Ruth looked at him for a moment. You called Bev, she said. I did. She shook her head slowly, and something moved across her face that was not quite exasperation, and was not quite something else, and was, underneath both of those things, a woman who had been alone for 19 months finally, reluctantly, and with enormous dignity, allowing herself to not be alone. Come in, she said. I'll make coffee. On the 22nd of December, 3 days before Christmas, 41 motorcycles pulled onto Canary Creek Road. Not because anyone had organized it. Not because there was a plan. Trace had mentioned the Wednesday before that he was going to drive out on the 22nd, just to check in, bring some firewood. Phil had said he'd come too. Tommy had heard about it and said he'd ride down. And then Chester and Aurelio and Rand and a man named Curtis from the Wheeling chapter, who had heard the story secondhand and wanted to meet the woman who had walked across a rainy parking lot and handed 40 bikers her umbrella, because that was the kind of person he wanted to know. 41 motorcycles on Canary Creek Road in the third week of December, with the ridge behind the house dusted with the first snow of the year, and the smoke from the wood stove rising straight up in the cold, still air. They came with firewood and groceries, and a wreath that Aurelio's wife had made, because Aurelio had mentioned to his wife what was happening, and his wife had made a wreath, because that was the kind of woman Aurelio had married, and the wreath had a red bow and smelled like cedar. They came with a card signed by 73 people, because the story had moved through the phone chains by then, and people who had never met Ruth Calloway had asked to sign it, which they had done in a roll call of names from across the state. They came with a check for $412 that Phil had collected in $12 increments from 34 people, because he'd posted the story in the chapter group, and 34 people had sent $12 each without being asked to. 12 being the chapter's traditional number for this kind of thing, and it had added up. They pulled onto the road, and they parked, and the engine stopped, and the street went quiet, and the snow on the ridge caught the afternoon light, and Ruth Calloway opened her front door. She stood on the new porch steps, and she looked at 41 motorcycles on her road and 41 men standing in the snow, and she was silent for a long moment. Trace Bowen walked to the bottom of the steps. He held out the card. Ruth took it. She looked at the wreath. She looked at the firewood being stacked under the overhang. She looked at the check, which Phil handed her separately, folded once. She unfolded it. She looked at the amount. She looked up at Trace. $412, she said. 12 from each person, Trace said. 34 people. 34 people I don't know, she said. 34 people who know about you, he said. Ruth Calloway stood on her front porch in the first snow of December with a card signed by 73 people and a wreath that smelled like cedar and $412 and 41 men standing in her road, and she was quiet for a long time. She didn't break. That's the thing about her. She didn't break. She held herself with the same composed dignity she'd held in the parking lot, the same clear-eyed steadiness she'd held in the kitchen when Phil told her about the furnace. But her hands, holding the card, were trembling. Just her hands. Trace pretended not to see. He was good at that. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "we were wondering if we could come in." "It's cold out here." Ruth looked at him. Something happened in her face that was not a smile and was not a cry and was not anything with a clean name. And then she stepped aside and held the door open and said, "I'll need to put more water on." 41 men filed into a house on Canary Creek Road. It had not held that many people since Earl Calloway's funeral 19 months ago. Ruth stood in the kitchen and put the kettle on, and then she stood with her hands flat on the counter and looked out the window at the ridge in the snow. And she was quiet. Bev Haskins, who had gotten Rand's call and driven over and arrived just behind the last motorcycle, found her like that and stood beside her and didn't say anything, because she had known Ruth Calloway for 37 years and knew what the moment needed, which was company and not words. Ruth looked at the ridge for a long time. "He would have loved this," she said. Bev put her arm around her. "He would have fed them all," Ruth said, and laughed a little, and then stopped, and was quiet again. In the living room, the wood stove was going, and the fire was the right height, and the house was warm. Ruth Calloway still lives on Canary Creek Road. The porch steps are solid. The furnace runs clean. The wood stove gets used from October to March by a woman who no longer has to wonder whether someone will bring wood. In the spring, Trace Bowen and a man named Curtis drove up on a Saturday and turned the garden over and planted the back row with sunflowers, which were Ruth's idea and which she communicated to Trace on a Wednesday in late February by sliding a seed packet across the kitchen table and saying nothing, which Trace understood completely. The sunflowers came up in July. They were 6 feet tall by August. Ruth put one in the vase on the windowsill. Not dried. This time, fresh. There are winters in this world that feel like something designed to remind you how alone you are. Cold that comes in under the door and through the gap in the window frame. A thermostat you're afraid to touch. One chair left out at an angle because the habit of it has outlasted the person who made it a habit. And there is nothing, and no one coming. And you manage. Because managing is what you do, and the managing is its own kind of courage, and you are allowed to call that enough. And then, on a wet Saturday in November, 40 strangers come through the rain, and they are cold, and you have one umbrella. And you walk across the parking lot, and you hold it out, and you say you boys look cold. And everything that follows from that, the porch steps and the furnace and the firewood and the 73 signatures and the first real warmth in 19 months, everything follows from that one small act of noticing. Ruth Calloway noticed. The world noticed back. If this story reached you, if you believe that one small act of generosity can come back to a person 100-fold, hit that like and share it with someone who needs to hear that this winter. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. And drop a comment below. Is there a Ruth in your life? Someone who gives what she has without thinking about what she has. Tell me who she is. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one.